Hello and welcome to the 51st edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm Cinny, your host, and today's topic is the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, better known as CBAM, and why it is about to become the most important piece of climate policy that many exporters will only notice when an EU customer emails them with the subject line "Urgent Emissions Data Request," and a deadline that suggests time travel is now part of trade compliance. CBAM is the EU's carbon charge on certain carbon-intensive imports. The policy logic is straightforward. The EU has spent years tightening the screws on its own industrial emissions through the EU Emissions Trading System, another sustainable acronym ETS, and it does not want a situation where production simply relocates to places with weaker carbon constraints, then ships the same products back into Europe with a clean conscience and a dirty footprint. CBAM is designed to align the carbon cost of imports with the carbon cost faced by EU producers, so emissions reductions happen in the real world rather than in a spreadsheet of offshored production. From a sustainability leadership perspective, this is the EU doing what it tends to do when it decides something matters. It writes rules. It makes them enforceable. It then exports those rules through the gravitational pull of its single market. CBAM is a case study in that approach, taking a climate ambition that used to live inside EU borders and extending its economic signal across supply chains that stretch around the planet. At the centre of CBAM is a deceptively simple idea. If the EU puts a price on carbon for domestic producers, it needs a comparable mechanism for imports. Otherwise, the policy punishes the diligent and rewards the evasive. The official language talks about embedded emissions, meaning the greenhouse gases released during the production of certain goods. Think of it as the carbon that is baked into the product before it ever reaches a European port. Under CBAM, EU importers must declare the products that fall under the mechanism, declare the embedded emissions associated with those products expressed in carbon dioxide equivalent, report whether a carbon price has already been paid in the country of origin, and then pay a levy via the purchase of CBAM certificates priced in line with the EU ETS carbon price. That last point is where the policy stops being an abstract governance discussion and becomes a commercial reality. If the EU ETS carbon price is high, CBAM costs rise. If it falls, CBAM costs fall. The policy is not picking a number and calling it morale. It is plugging imports into the existing carbon market signal and letting the economics do what economics does, which is to turn emissions into a line item that procurement teams suddenly care about. Economists usually go nuts about this type of mechanism. The scope of the policy also matters. To start, CBAM covers 6 commodities: aluminium, iron and steel, cement, electricity, fertilizer, and hydrogen. That list captures heavy industry, where emissions intensity is material, data can be measured with some rigour, and trade volumes into the EU are significant. It also captures sectors that are strategically central to the net zero transition, since you do not build wind turbines, transmission lines, solar frames, electrolyzers, or low-carbon construction without large volumes of steel, aluminium, cement, and chemicals. CBAM is climate policy meeting industrial strategy in the most European way possible, by creating compliance rules that quietly restructure markets. There is also a timeline reality that matters for how firms should respond. In broad terms, the early phase was about reporting, building systems, and getting importers and suppliers used to the choreography of emissions disclosure. The next phase is where money changes hands through CBAM certificates. For many businesses, that shift is what will make CBAM feel real, even though their underlying obligations and data expectations have been building for a while. If you are an exporter outside the EU, CBAM can feel like a policy aimed at someone else. Strictly speaking, the legal responsibility for reporting and paying sites with the EU-based importer. That is accurate, and it is also a comforting technicality that will last right up until your EU customer asks you for verified emissions data, a product-level methodology, and evidence of any carbon price paid at origin. CBAM moves the compliance burden upstream, and supply chains have a talent for passing burdens to whoever is least able to ignore them. This is how sustainability requirements spread through purchase orders. So what changes commercially on January 1st? Customer expectations must first evolve. EU importers will need clear and comparable emissions data for CBAM declarations. If you can provide high-quality data quickly, you become a low-friction supplier. If you cannot, you become a project for someone's internal compliance team, and procurement tends to prefer suppliers that do not create homework. Next, price competitiveness comes under pressure. CBAM certificate costs become a procurement variable. In simple terms, a high emissions product becomes more expensive at the EU border than a lower emissions equivalent, ceteris paribus. That differential is the point. It creates an incentive to decarbonize production methods, switch to cleaner energy, and invest in lower carbon processes. If you are already doing those things, CBAM has the potential to turn your sustainability investments into a commercial advantage rather than a corporate social responsibility footnote. Business resilience should also start to intersect with climate performance. Many of the same measures that reduce emissions can also reduce exposure to fuel price volatility, improve energy efficiency, and lower long-term operating costs. There is a strong overlap between decarbonisation and operational excellence, especially in energy-intensive sectors. A firm that improves process efficiency and electrifies wisely is not only reducing embedded emissions, it is also buying itself more predictability in a world that has become allergic to stable energy prices. Another key impact: sustainability becomes a procurement priority rather than a marketing preference. That change is already underway across large corporate buyers. CBAM accelerates it by embedding climate data into trade compliance. When emissions data becomes part of the import declaration process, it stops being optional. Finally, carbon pricing goes global, or at least more global than it was. CBAM will have a pronounced ripple effect. The prospect of paying a carbon levy at the EU border encourages other jurisdictions to explore their own approaches, and it encourages exporting countries to consider domestic carbon pricing, so value is retained at home rather than paid abroad. In real policy terms, CBAM can pressure governments to develop carbon markets, carbon taxes, or sectoral decarbonisation frameworks. In real political terms, it also creates a new set of arguments at trade forums, which will keep lawyers, diplomats, and think tanks in stable employment and conference mode for years to come. Now, let's pour into the detail that many of our listeners might find a bit on the boring side unless you're excited by quantities of data. CBAM runs on measurement, reporting, and verification. It asks importers to declare embedded emissions, and embedded emissions require credible calculations. For exporters, the operational response begins with knowing whether your products fall under CBAM scope. That mapping often starts with combined nomenclature codes, the classification system used for goods entering the EU. Once you know the relevant product codes, the next step is to identify where those products enter EU supply chains. Sometimes you export directly to EU customers. Sometimes you sell to traders or downstream manufacturers who later sell into the EU. CBAM cares more about where the product ends up than the diplomacy surrounding your supply chain story. Once applicability is clear, you need a defensible picture of emissions. This means mapping production processes and emission sources, gathering consumption data across relevant activities, and then calculating product carbon footprints using accepted approaches. Depending on the sector, That could involve direct monitoring, calculations using activity data, and mass balance allocation methods. None of that is conceptually difficult for an industrial operator. The difficulty is operational discipline, consistent boundaries, and ensuring the dataset is fully legitimate and can survive scrutiny. The emissions themselves have categories. Direct emissions are the baseline requirement across CBAM covered goods, meaning emissions directly attributable to the production process and associated waste. Indirect emissions, mainly from energy use during production, can also be required for certain goods. Cement and fertilizer are particularly important here, where electricity and energy inputs can materially shape the footprint. Metals can have different treatment around electricity-related indirect emissions. This is where arguments about system boundaries start, and where methodology choices can shift reported emissions enough to change commercial outcomes. For exporters, the key point is not to wait until a customer asks for data and then scramble for something that looks plausible. Credibility is not optional. EU customers will increasingly want data that is consistent, comparable, and verified by an independent party. That independent verification matters because it reduces risk for the importer and therefore reduces friction. There is also a practical mechanism emerging for data sharing. Non-EU companies can register and upload emissions data through the CBAM registries portal designed for non-EU operators. In principle, this creates a one-time disclosure channel where you upload company information and emissions data, and EU customers access it through your unique identification details. In practice, the portal will not replace customer questions. It will reduce duplication and create a baseline dataset that can be referenced consistently across buyers. If that all sounds like extra work, well, it certainly is. Still, it is the kind of extra work that separates suppliers who remain competitive from suppliers who become legacy, which is a polite business word for "we used to buy from them." The decarbonisation response is where the policy becomes an opportunity rather than a cost. Once you have emissions hotspots identified, you can target reductions. There are several levers that matter across the CBAM sectors. Energy efficiency upgrades are often the quickest route. Industrial equipment retrofits, better process controls, waste heat recovery, and improved maintenance regimes can lower energy consumption per tonne of output. That reduces both emissions and operating costs. Not glamorous, but it works. Real-time emissions monitoring helps track reductions and supports continuous improvement. It also strengthens your credibility with customers, since you can show a measurement culture rather than a one-off calculation. Waste reduction and material efficiency schemes can cut emissions intensity per tonne by reducing scrap rates, improving yields, and recycling materials within production loops. This matters in metals and cement where process losses can be substantial. Fuel switching and electrification can reduce direct emissions, depending on the grid emissions factor and the technology pathway. Electrification is not automatically low carbon, and the grid mix matters, so a thoughtful approach beats a fashionable one. On site, renewable energy can reduce indirect emissions and improve resilience. Even partial coverage through renewables can make a meaningful difference to the product footprint in electricity-sensitive processes. Switching to clean energy sources for production lines, whether through direct procurement of renewable electricity or credible contractual instruments, can further reduce the footprint and align you with customer decarbonisation requirements. A sensible implementation plan starts with quick wins and builds toward capital-intensive upgrades. The phrase "quick win" has been abused in business culture, often meaning, "we did something small and called it strategy." In this context, it means sequencing. Start with measures that can be deployed rapidly to reduce emissions intensity, then build toward deeper process changes that require capital, downtime, and engineering redesign. This is also where targets matter. EU customers increasingly look for credible reduction targets, including near-term targets and longer-term net zero pathways. A target without a plan is a press release. A target with milestones is a business signal. It tells your buyer you are actively managing your emissions. Now, it would be dishonest to pretend CBAM is frictionless and will not cause considerable problems for a number of businesses currently doing business in the EU. It is ambitious, technical, and it touches trade, geopolitics, and industrial competitiveness. One category of issues is administrative complexity. Importers need data and suppliers need systems to provide it. Smaller exporters can face disproportionate burden. The compliance architecture tends to favour large firms with established sustainability teams, mature data systems, and the ability to pay for verification. That creates an equity challenge. The climate problem is global. The ability to comply is uneven. Another category is methodology disputes. Embedded emissions accounting is technical, and small differences in boundaries can create meaningful differences in declared emissions. There will be inevitable debates about what counts, what gets excluded, how indirect emissions are treated, and how waste gases and co-products are allocated. This is what happens when you turn emissions into a traded compliance variable. Another category is trade politics. CBAM sits in the overlap between climate policy and trade rules. Some countries will view it as environmental necessity. Others will view it as disguised protectionism. In the current global environment surrounding trade masquerading as power politics, those arguments will not disappear. They will evolve through legal challenges, diplomatic negotiation, and the slow grind of international alignment. From an EU perspective, the central defence is that CBAM is designed to mirror internal carbon constraints, not to create arbitrary tariffs. From a sceptical perspective, it still reshapes competitiveness, and reshaping competitiveness is the raw fuel for what trade disputes. There is also the question of carbon pricing paid at origin. CBAM allows importers to deduct carbon prices already paid in the country of production or purchase from the CBAM certificates required, which is important for fairness and avoids double charging. Still, that deduction depends on evidence, definitions, and comparability. Countries with robust carbon pricing systems will find pathways to recognition. Countries without them will face pressure. That is a feature from the EU's standpoint and a provocation from others. The EU has also taken steps towards simplification and refinement, which is a polite way of saying the system is complex enough that lawmakers have already started sanding down sharp edges. That will continue. CBAM is a multi-year policy build, not a single switch flick. So where does this leave us in terms of the big picture? CBAM is not a niche compliance story. It is the EU asserting that decarbonisation is not only a domestic transition plan, it is also a trade principle. That is a profound shift. It says that climate policy can be enforced at borders, that emissions accounting can be embedded into customs processes, and that market access can be influenced by carbon intensity. For the planet, the potential value is clear. If CBAM works as intended, it reduces incentives to relocate emissions, strengthens decarbonisation signals across global supply chains, and accelerates investment in low-carbon industrial processes. It also helps protect the political durability of EU climate policy by addressing fairness. Voters tend to support climate action more reliably when they believe everyone is playing by the same rules, including firms outside the border that sell into the market. Let's not lose sight of the fact that CBAM is central to the EU's strategy to cut carbon emissions by 55% ahead of 2030. For exporters and industrial producers outside the EU, the strategic message is equally clear. CBAM is creating a premium for low-carbon products in one of the world's largest markets. That premium is not a compliance-linked cost differential. The firms that measure well, verify well, and decarbonise steadily will be better placed to defend margins and grow share. The firms that treat CBAM as an external annoyance will find that annoyance has a way of showing up in contract negotiations. For governments outside the EU, CBAM creates a policy lever. It encourages domestic carbon pricing, credible emissions reporting, and industrial decarbonisation strategies so countries can retain carbon revenue domestically and support their industries rather than exporting both emissions and payments to Europe. It also creates pressure for international standards on product carbon footprinting, verification, and data exchange. That is a slow process, and slow processes are the ones that shape the next decade. For sustainable finance, CBAM adds an investable lens to heavy industry transition. If carbon intensity becomes a border cost, then emissions reduction projects gain a clearer revenue and risk story. Energy efficiency capex, electrification upgrades, process innovations, and renewable procurement can be framed not only as climate-aligned investments and as competitiveness investments. Lenders and equity investors can model CBAM exposure and decarbonisation paybacks with more confidence. That is where policy starts to shift capital allocation, which is where the real leverage is. Let's end with a practical observation that applies to everyone from steelmakers to fertiliser producers to the EU importers trying to keep their compliance team from quitting. CBAM turns carbon data into commercial data. The best time to build a credible dataset was yesterday. The next best time is today, before your biggest EU customer forwards you a spreadsheet template that assumes you have been measuring emissions at product level since the early Renaissance. CBAM is not perfect. It will have growing pains. It will create big disputes. It will generate more than a few awkward conversations between procurement and sustainability teams. Still, it is also one of the clearest examples of a major economic bloc turning climate ambition into enforceable market design. If the world is serious about industrial decarbonisation, mechanisms like this are going to multiply, adapt, and spread. The EU has once again followed the courage of its convictions and placed a marker. Access to the market increasingly comes with a carbon receipt attached. That is a hard truth for some producers. It is also a blueprint for aligning trade with climate outcomes, and in the long run, that alignment is the kind of structural change that moves the emissions curve, not the kind that merely improves corporate storytelling. Wow, that's a wrap on our 51st GreenWave podcast episode. We appreciate you sharing your valuable time with us. You can find the pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM, so feel free to follow and share with friends. We'd love if you would leave a 5-star review. If you have missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the GreenWave Gazette, you can always catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.